dawn breaks over Loch Ness. Scottish Highlands. Stone walls rise from the water's edge, blackened by centuries of fire. Empty window frames stare across dark water, where no monster ever mattered as much as the men who bled here. Walls deliberately destroyed by their own defenders. A single tower standing where a fortress once sprawled. 13 different clans claiming ownership across 5 centuries. Bloodstains the guidebooks never mention. Urquhart Castle changed hands so many times that by the 1690s, the British Crown ordered it destroyed rather than let it fall to enemies again. Strategic necessity or endless futility. If you enjoy deep investigations into medieval architecture and the violent histories behind Scotland's most fought-over fortresses, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which castle to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. Stand at the ruins of Urquhart Castle today, and the first thing you notice is the water. Loch Ness stretches dark and cold to the north and south, 23 miles of deep fresh water, cutting through the Great Glen like a knife wound through the Highlands. The second thing you notice is the tower, a single stone structure rising from the rubble, 5 stories tall, facing inland rather than toward the loch. Tourist guides call it the Grant Tower. They explain that it was built in the early 1500s, that it offers spectacular views, that on clear days you can see for miles across the water, where people still search for a monster that probably never existed. What they mention less often is why the tower faces the wrong direction, or why this castle, positioned on one of the most strategic pieces of ground in Scotland, was blown up by its own garrison rather than left standing for the next inevitable siege. Or why, across 400 years of documented history, Urquhart Castle changed hands more than 40 times, captured, recaptured, burned, rebuilt, abandoned, re-garrisoned, and destroyed over and over in an endless cycle that consumed thousands of lives and left nothing but stone skeletons and half-remembered violence. The story they tell tourists is about Jacobites and noble clans, about Scotland's struggle for independence, about picturesque ruins and convenient backdrops for Loch Ness monster photos. That story is true as far as it goes, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is written in the thickness of the walls, in the char marks that still streak the interior stones, in the records of soldiers who deserted their posts rather than stay another winter, in the decision, unprecedented in Scottish military history, to request permission to destroy your own fortress because keeping it was worse than losing it. This is not a story about a castle. This is a story about a place that consumed everyone who tried to hold it, a position so valuable that kings bankrupted themselves trying to control it, and so cursed, or so costly, depending on whether you believe in curses, or simply an accumulated human failure, that the only way to stop the killing was to make the castle itself disappear. The ruins stand today as a memorial, not to anyone who died here, not to any clan who held it, but to the futility of trying to make permanent what geography and violence had decided would always be temporary. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moment when someone first looked at this promontory and thought, this ground is worth dying for. The ground beneath Urquhart Castle is older than Scotland itself. The promontory juts into Loch Ness at Strone Point, a natural platform of rock and earth that rises roughly 15 meters above the waterline. Geologists will tell you it was shaped by glaciers 10,000 years ago, carved and compressed into a defensible position by forces far older and stronger than any human army. The Picts understood this long before Christianity reached the Highlands. Before clans had names or borders had meaning, the Picts built hill forts across Scotland. Urquhart's location shows signs of Pictish occupation, stone foundations buried beneath medieval construction, fragments of carved symbols that predate written Scottish history, burial mounds on the eastern edge of the promontory that were disturbed and built over centuries later. We don't know what the Picts called this place. We don't know how many people lived here, or whether they fought to defend it, or whether they simply vanished, like so many other Pictish communities, when new powers arrived from the south and west. What we do know is that by 580 AD, an Irish monk named Columba had established a Christian mission somewhere near Loch Ness. His biographer, Adamnan, writing a century later, recorded the event in Life of Saint Columba. The text describes Columba converting local Picts, performing miracles, and famously encountering a large creature in the waters of the River Ness. That creature would become legend. The mission would become a footnote. But both are important because they mark the first written record of settlement at what would become Urquhart. Columba's mission was not alone for long. Christianity spread through the Highlands in waves, carried by monks who built wooden churches and small monasteries in strategic locations. Loch Ness was strategic not for religious reasons, but for practical ones. It sat at the center of the Great Glen, the only low-altitude passage through the otherwise impassable Highland mountains. Any traveler moving from Scotland's east coast to its west coast had to pass through this corridor. Any army invading from the south had to control it. A church on this ground meant safety for travelers. A fortification meant control of the route. For the next 600 years, the historical record goes quiet. Scattered references in Irish annals mention fortresses of the Gaels and the battles of the Ness, but specifics are lost. What we can infer from archaeology is this: wooden palisades rose and burned and were rebuilt. Small keeps replaced them. Stone began to appear in the 1100s as Norman building techniques reached Scotland. By 1230, Scotland had consolidated under a single crown. Alexander II ruled from Edinburgh, but his control of the Highlands was contested, theoretical, dependent on the loyalty of powerful families who governed vast territories with minimal oversight. The Great Glen remained a corridor anyone could use. That was unacceptable. King William I, called William the Lion, had already recognized the problem decades earlier. His grandson, Alexander II, inherited both the crown and the strategic headache. In 1229, he made a decision that would shape the next 500 years of bloodshed. He ordered a proper castle built at Urquhart, not a wooden fort, not a minor keep, a stone fortress capable of holding a permanent garrison, withstanding siege, and controlling every mile of water visible from its walls. The work began under the supervision of Alan Durward, a powerful noble who had recently married into the royal family. Durward understood castles. He had fought in the Crusades, seen fortifications in the Holy Land, and knew what modern military engineering looked like. He brought that knowledge home. The Urquhart that took shape between 1230 and 1250 was formidable by Highland standards. A curtain wall, roughly 150 meters in perimeter, wrapped around the promontory. Towers anchored each corner. A gatehouse controlled the only land approach from the south. Inside the walls, timber buildings housed the garrison, stored supplies, and sheltered livestock during siege. The walls themselves were 5 meters thick at the base, tapering to 3 meters at the parapet walk. This wasn't decorative. This was engineering designed to absorb impacts from siege engines and provide platforms for defenders to rain projectiles on attackers below. The Durward family was given custody of the castle and granted lands around Loch Ness to support its garrison. They held it for 66 years. Those years were not peaceful. Rival clans raided frequently. Local lords disputed boundaries and grazing rights. But Urquhart's walls held, and the crown's authority in the Highlands was, for the first time in centuries, backed by stone and steel rather than vague promises. Then England arrived. In 1296, Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, and later as the Hammer of the Scots, invaded Scotland with a meticulously planned military campaign. Edward was not raiding, he was conquering. His forces moved through southern Scotland methodically, capturing Edinburgh Castle, Roxburgh, Stirling, and every other strategic fortress. By late 1296, Edward's eyes turned north. The Highlands had always been difficult for southern armies to penetrate. Terrain was harsh, supply lines stretched thin, and local resistance was fierce. But Edward understood the Great Glen. Control that corridor, and you control northern Scotland. Let it stay in Scottish hands, and you face endless raids, ambushes, and a recruitment ground for rebels. Urquhart Castle sat at the heart of the glen. An English force, under Sir William Fitzwarren, marched north in autumn 1296. We don't have detailed records of the siege. What survives are expense accounts, showing payments to engineers, mentions of the castle on the Ness in administrative records, and a brief note in English military logs, stating that Urquhart was secured for the king by November. The Durwards were dispossessed. English soldiers garrisoned the walls. For the first time in its history as a stone fortress, Urquhart Castle had changed hands by force. It would not be the last. The English occupation of Urquhart was efficient but brutal. Garrisons and occupied castles had to be supplied from the south, which meant long convoys moving through hostile territory. Local Scots, furious at the loss of their independence, raided supply lines, ambushed patrols, and made life for English soldiers a constant grind of low-level violence. Edward II's strategy depended on holding key fortresses long enough to break Scottish resistance. He believed, correctly, that castles symbolized power. As long as English banners flew from Urquhart, Stirling, and Edinburgh, Scottish morale would crumble. He was wrong about the morale, and he fatally underestimated one man, Robert the Bruce. In 1306, Robert the Bruce crowned himself King of Scotland. It was a desperate, defiant act. Bruce had few allies, limited resources, and most of Scotland's nobility either opposed him or stayed neutral. But he had something Edward IV didn't fully appreciate: a willingness to destroy rather than lose. Bruce's military strategy was unconventional for the era. Instead of besieging English-held castles and trying to capture them intact, he captured them and then demolished them completely. Walls pulled down, gates burned, towers reduced to rubble. This scorched earth approach baffled English commanders. Why destroy your own fortifications? Why deny yourself the use of castles you just risked lives to take? Bruce's reasoning was cold and strategic. He couldn't hold every castle he captured. He didn't have enough men to garrison them all. If he left them standing, English forces would simply recapture them, so he made them useless to everyone. In 1308, Bruce's forces moved through the Highlands, targeting English garrisons in a coordinated campaign. Urquhart was among them. The siege was short. Bruce's forces surrounded the castle, cut off resupply, and likely negotiated surrender terms with the English commander. Medieval sieges often ended this way. Defending a doomed position to the last man was less common than Hollywood suggests. If the outcome was inevitable, commanders surrendered in exchange for safe passage and their lives. The English garrison marched out, Bruce's men marched in, and then they got to work. They stripped the castle of anything valuable: weapons, tools, stored grain, livestock. Then they set fire to every wooden structure inside the walls. Barracks, stables, storehouses, all burned. Engineers used picks and hammers to undermine sections of the curtain wall, collapsing them inward. The gatehouse was deliberately destroyed to make the entrance impassable. When Bruce's men left, Urquhart Castle was a ruin. For the next 20 years, it stayed that way. Locals pulled stones from the wreckage to build cottages. Shepherds grazed sheep on the promontory. The once mighty fortress that Edward I had garrisoned became a memory. But the ground remained strategic, and memory, in Scotland, never dies. Chapter 2. The Wars of Independence, 1296 to 1400 AD. Robert the Bruce died in 1329. His son, David II, inherited the crown and a kingdom that was technically independent, but still surrounded by English threats. Edward III of England had ambitions in France. The 100 Years' War was beginning, but he also wanted to finish what his grandfather Edward I had started in Scotland. The destruction of Urquhart and dozens of other Scottish castles had achieved Bruce's goal. England couldn't easily reoccupy what no longer stood, but it also meant Scotland had no fortified network in the Highlands. When Edward III invaded in 1333, Scottish forces lacked defensible positions to slow the English advance. The disaster at Halidon Hill in 1333 shattered Scottish military power. David II fled to France. English forces once again occupied southern Scotland, and Urquhart, still in ruins, became a problem someone needed to solve. The question was, who? Clan Grant claimed ancestral rights to the land. Clan MacDonald disputed that claim. The Crown, now operating from exile, couldn't enforce either claim. English forces, stretched thin across southern Scotland, didn't have the resources to rebuild and garrison a castle in the remote Highlands. So Urquhart sat empty for decades. This period, roughly 1330 to 1360, is murky in the historical record, but archaeological evidence suggests limited reoccupation. Timber structures were built over the ruined stone foundations. Someone was living there, though whether as a defensive garrison, a clan stronghold, or simply squatters is unclear. What is clear is that by 1360, as David II returned from exile and English forces withdrew from southern Scotland, someone had decided Urquhart was worth rebuilding. The work was not royal. The crown had no money. Instead, local lords, operating with vague royal authorization, began reconstruction piecemeal. Clan Grant provided labor and materials. Sections of the curtain wall were restored. The gatehouse remained ruined, but a new timber gate was installed. The interior was rebuilt with wood and thatch, cheap, fast, and functional. This version of Urquhart Castle was a shadow of its former self, but it could house soldiers, store weapons, and project power across Loch Ness. That was enough. For the next century, Urquhart cycled through a grim pattern. Clan conflicts erupted every few years. One clan would seize the castle, another would raid and take it back. The crown, distant and distracted by conflicts in southern Scotland and England, issued periodic proclamations declaring who officially controlled Urquhart. Those proclamations were ignored by everyone who actually lived near the castle. In 1390, a massive raid by the Lords of the Isles devastated the Highlands. Alexander Stewart, called the Wolf of Badenoch, burned Elgin Cathedral and ravaged Moray. His forces likely hit Urquhart as well. Records mention the castle being ruinous and undefended by 1400. This chaos was not unusual for medieval Scotland, but it was unsustainable. The Great Glen remained a strategic corridor. Whoever controlled Edinburgh might claim to rule Scotland, but without fortified control of the Highlands, that rule was purely theoretical. James I of Scotland understood this when he took power in 1424. He had spent 18 years imprisoned in England and had studied English governance closely. He returned to Scotland, determined to centralize power, break the independence of overconfident nobles, and build a functioning state. Urquhart Castle was part of that plan. James confiscated the castle from whichever clan currently claimed it. Records are contradictory, and handed it to a loyal supporter. Then he allocated funds from the royal treasury to begin serious reconstruction. The work proceeded slowly through the 1440s and 1450s. Stonemasons returned to the site. The curtain wall was repaired properly. Mortar and dressed stone replacing timber patches. Interior buildings were constructed in stone rather than wood, making them fireproof and defensible. But money kept running out. Royal funds dried up. Work stopped, then resumed, then stopped again. The castle was functional by 1460, but far from finished. And then, predictably, violence returned. In 1452, Clan MacDonald raided Urquhart with a force large enough to overwhelm the garrison. They held it for 3 years before Crown forces retook it. In 1464, another raid. In 1472, another. Each cycle of capture and recapture damaged the fortifications. Each repair cost money the crown didn't have. The lords tasked with holding Urquhart complained constantly about insufficient men, insufficient supplies, insufficient support from Edinburgh. The crown's answer, in 1509, was to change the strategy entirely. Instead of trying to garrison Urquhart directly, James IV granted the castle and surrounding lands to a single powerful family and made them responsible for its defense. The grants. This decision would define the next 183 years. The grants would hold Urquhart longer than anyone before or since, but holding is not the same as peace. The castle would see more blood under grant control than it had in the previous 200 years combined. Chapter 3. The Grant Dynasty begins. 1509 to 1545 AD. The Grant family received Urquhart Castle in 1509 under a royal charter from James IV. The grant was explicit. The Grants would hold the castle in perpetuity as hereditary keepers, responsible for its defense, maintenance, and use as a base to enforce royal authority in the Highlands. In return, the crown provided something unprecedented: £8,000 in direct funding to rebuild and fortify Urquhart to modern standards. £8,000 in early 16th century currency translates to millions in modern terms. This was not a token gesture. James IV was making a serious investment in Highland security, and he was betting that the Grants could deliver where previous keepers had failed. The Grants took the job seriously. Between 1509 and 1520, Urquhart underwent its most comprehensive reconstruction since the 1230s. The curtain wall was entirely rebuilt in sections, raised to a uniform height, and strengthened with buttresses. The gatehouse, which had been a weak point for decades, was redesigned with a reinforced tower and a double gate system. The interior was cleared of temporary timber structures and replaced with permanent stone buildings, a great hall for the clan chief, barracks for soldiers, a kitchen complex, storerooms, and a well to ensure water supply during siege. Most importantly, the Grants constructed what would become the only surviving intact structure at Urquhart, the Grant Tower. The tower rises 5 stories, built with walls 2 meters thick and designed to serve as a last resort stronghold. If the outer defenses fell, the ground floor was storage. The second floor housed soldiers. The third floor contained the laird's private chambers. The fourth floor was a great room for councils and feasts. The fifth floor was the roof platform, providing 360-degree views of the surrounding countryside and loch. But here's where things get strange. The tower faces inland, south, toward the land approach. Most watchtowers in Scottish castles of this era faced water, where attack was most likely. Loch Ness provided the easiest approach to Urquhart. Boats could land troops quickly, bypassing the rough Highland terrain. Yet the Grant Tower turns its back to the loch. No surviving document explains why. Architectural historians have speculated for decades. Some suggest It was simply a matter of where the bedrock was strongest. Others argue the Grants were more concerned with raids from rival clans approaching overland than with seaborne assault. But locals offered a different explanation, one that was never written down in official records, but persisted in oral tradition. The tower faced away from the water because no one wanted to watch the loch at night. The Grants officially took full control in 1512. For the next 30 years, Urquhart functioned exactly as James IV had intended. The Grants used it as a base to patrol the Great Glen, settle disputes, and prevent rival clans from raiding crown lands. They hosted royal representatives, maintained the garrison at their own expense, beyond the initial royal grant, and generally fulfilled their obligations. Then, in 1545, everything fell apart. Clan MacDonald, of Clan Ranald, had long disputed grant control of lands around Loch Ness. Legal claims dated back decades. Appeals to the crown had gone nowhere, so the MacDonalds decided to settle the matter directly. In July 1545, a MacDonald warband, approximately 300 men, though numbers vary in different accounts, descended on Urquhart. The attack was not a raid. It was an assault meant to destroy. The Grants had garrisoned Urquhart with roughly 80 men, a reasonable number for peacetime patrols and deterring small raids, not remotely enough to hold walls against 300 attackers who came prepared for siege. The battle lasted less than a day. MacDonald forces overwhelmed the outer defenses, breached the gatehouse, and poured into the courtyard. What followed was slaughter. Scottish clan warfare in the 1500s was personal and brutal. This was not formal battle with prisoners and ransom. This was elimination. By the time the MacDonalds left, every person inside Urquhart Castle was dead. Every structure that could burn was burned. Livestock was slaughtered. Stores were emptied or destroyed. Except one person survived, a clerk named John Fraser, responsible for keeping the castle's administrative records. He was found hiding in the cellars 3 days later by Grant reinforcements arriving from nearby estates. Fraser recorded what he had witnessed. His account, preserved in the Grant family archives, describes the attack in detail: the breach, the fighting in the courtyard, the killing of non-combatants, the fires. Then, mid-paragraph, the account stops. The rest of the page was torn out. It's never been found. No one knows what Fraser wrote in that missing section, but his survival was unusual enough to note. The MacDonalds were thorough. They had no strategic reason to leave a clerk alive. Yet Fraser wasn't killed with the others. He wasn't found during the 3-day occupation. He simply escaped notice. Later accounts, written by Grant historians, suggest Fraser's survival was providential. God preserved him to bear witness. Local accounts suggested something else, that Fraser wasn't hiding in the cellars at all during those 3 days, that he was seen in the village, walking the streets as if nothing had happened, before returning to the castle after the MacDonalds left. This might simply be confusion in traumatized witnesses, or it might be that Fraser, knowing what was coming, walked out before the killing started and walked back in after, playing the role of survivor to avoid suspicion of collaboration. We don't know. The page is missing. What we do know is that the 1545 raid traumatized the Grant family. They rebuilt Urquhart again. The crown provided additional funds, but the psychological impact of total massacre lingered. Garrisons were doubled. Patrols became more aggressive. Trust in neighboring clans evaporated. And every few years, like clockwork, violence returned. Chapter 4. Endless Siege, 1545 to 1650 AD. The century following, the 1545 massacre, settled into a grim rhythm. Urquhart Castle was attacked, on average, once every decade, not minor skirmishes. Full assaults meant to capture or destroy. 1577. A raid. By Clan MacDonald, Garrison held, castle damaged, but functional. 1603. Another MacDonald raid, possibly coordinated with other anti-Grant actions across the Highlands. Gatehouse, partially destroyed, rebuilt within 2 years. 1623. Crown records note additional funds allocated for the repair and fortification of Urquhart, lately damaged by assault. No details on who attacked or why. The Grants, to their credit, kept rebuilding. Urquhart was not just a castle to them. It was a symbol of legitimacy, proof that the crown had entrusted them with power. Abandoning it would mean admitting defeat, so they poured money and lives into maintaining a fortress that seemed cursed to attract violence. But by the early 1600s, something else was happening. Soldiers stationed at Urquhart were deserting at unusual rates. Desertion was always a problem in remote garrisons. Pay was irregular. Conditions were harsh. Soldiers stationed far from home often simply walked away. Courts martial records from the era are filled with desertion cases. But Urquhart's desertion rate stood out. Grant family correspondence from the 1630s and 1640s mentions the difficulty of keeping the castle fully manned. One letter, dated 1637, notes that men refuse the Ness posting, claiming the stones themselves are ill-fortuned. This is strange phrasing. Medieval soldiers were superstitious, but refusing military postings based on vague bad feelings was rare enough to require comment. Another letter, from 1642, is more direct. The garrison has lost 15 men since Michaelmas, 3 to desertion, 12 to illness of unknown origin. The surgeon reports no plague, no pox, yet men weaken and die within days of taking ill. 12 deaths from unknown illness in a single season suggests disease. Castles on cold, damp ground near water were breeding grounds for respiratory infections, dysentery, and typhus. This is the obvious explanation. But Grant records from the same period show that their other holdings, castles and estates elsewhere in the Highlands, did not experience similar mortality rates. Men stationed at Urquhart died faster than men stationed anywhere else under Grant control. The Grants tried to fix the problem practically. They improved drainage around the castle. They renovated the barracks to increase ventilation. They brought in physicians to examine water sources. The death rate didn't change. By 1650, another problem was brewing, one far larger than mysterious illnesses. England was tearing itself apart in civil war. Scotland was dragged into the conflict, forced to choose sides between King Charles I and Parliament. When Charles I was executed in 1649, Scotland declared his son, Charles II, the rightful king. England responded with overwhelming force. Oliver Cromwell invaded Scotland in 1650 with a professional army that crushed Scottish resistance in a matter of months. By 1651, Cromwell controlled most of Scotland, including the Highlands. Urquhart Castle was occupied by Cromwellian forces in 1652. The Grants, loyal to the royalist cause, fled or submitted. Cromwell's soldiers moved in, and for the first time in over a century, Urquhart was garrisoned by troops who had no blood ties to the land, no clan loyalties, no local superstitions. They were professionals, disciplined, experienced. They had fought across England, Ireland, and now Scotland. They were not the kind of men who spooked easily. Yet within 2 years, Cromwell's commanders were reporting the same problem the Grants had struggled with: high non-combat casualties. The garrison logs from Urquhart, preserved in English military archives, are detailed and methodical. They record arrivals, departures, supply deliveries, and deaths. Between 1652 and 1660, the logs show 37 combat deaths, skirmishes, raids, Accidents during patrol, 89 deaths, listed as illness, fever, or unknown causes. That's a ratio of 2.4 non-combat deaths for every combat death. Other Cromwellian garrisons in Scotland averaged 1 death from illness for every 3 combat deaths. Urquhart's ratio was inverted. Medical officers noted that many soldiers showed no symptoms before sudden collapse. Healthy men in the morning were dead by evening. Autopsies, rare but occasionally performed, showed no obvious disease. Lungs were clear. No signs of poisoning, just rapid, unexplained death. One officer, a Captain Edmund Harrow, wrote in a letter to his superiors in 1657, "The men fear this place. They speak of cold that cannot be explained by weather, of sounds in the cellars, when all are accounted for above. I do not give credence to such talk, yet I cannot explain why we lose men at such rates when supplies are adequate and the castle is sound." Cromwell's regime had no patience for supernatural explanations. When Harrow requested a transfer for himself and his men, he was denied. The garrison remained at Urquhart through the end of the interregnum in 1660. When Charles II was restored to the throne that year, and Cromwell's forces withdrew, the Grants reclaimed Urquhart. They found the castle structurally intact, but deeply unsettling. Graffiti had been carved into the stone walls by Cromwellian soldiers. Names, dates, Bible verses. Some of the carvings are still visible today. One, in the lower cellars, reads, "God preserve us from the watch we keep." The Grants moved back in. They restored the interiors. They regarrisoned the walls with their own men, and they tried to pretend the previous decade hadn't happened. But something had changed. The Grants had always known Urquhart was difficult. It attracted raids. It cost money. It sat in a remote, hard-to-supply location. But they had always believed it was worth holding. Now, looking at the crumbling walls and the carved prayers of terrified English soldiers, they began to wonder if they were wrong. Chapter 5. Cromwell's Dead. 1650 to 1692 AD. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 should have brought stability. The Grants had backed the royalist cause. Their loyalty was rewarded with confirmation of their lands and a return to power in the Highlands. Urquhart Castle was officially theirs once again, but the Scotland Charles II inherited was fractured. Religious conflicts between Episcopalians and Presbyterians tore at the kingdom's fabric. Political rivalries between clans, suppressed during the Cromwellian occupation, reignited immediately, and England's control over Scotland remained contested, formal in law, but weak in practice. The Grants returned to Urquhart with a reduced garrison and no clear sense of what they were defending anymore. The old justifications, royal authority, clan prestige, strategic control, had been rendered hollow by a decade of English occupation. Urquhart had been held by foreigners, and the world hadn't ended. The Great Glen remained passable. The Highlands remained ungoverned. So why keep pouring resources into a castle that everyone feared and no one wanted to live in? This question haunted Grant. Family councils through the 1660s and 1670s. Correspondence from the period shows deepening pessimism. One letter, dated 1672, is brutally honest. Urquhart stands only because we fear the shame of abandoning it. Yet men will not stay. Supplies cost more each year. The Crown offers no aid. If the MacDonald struck tomorrow, we could not hold. The Crown did offer occasional funds, small grants to repair storm damage, replace equipment, cover payroll gaps. But the amounts were token. Charles II's government was consumed by crises in England and Ireland. Scotland, especially the Highlands, was a low priority. By 1685, when James II of England took the throne, Urquhart Castle was garrisoned by fewer than 30 men. Sections of the curtain wall had collapsed and remained unrepaired. The gatehouse, damaged in a storm, was shored up with timber rather than rebuilt in stone. The Grant Tower still stood solid, but the rest of the fortress was decaying visibly. Then, in 1688, everything changed again. The Glorious Revolution deposed James VII and installed William of Orange and Mary as joint monarchs. Scotland fractured along new lines. Williamites, who supported the new Protestant monarchy, and Jacobites, who remained loyal to the Catholic Stuart line and wanted James VII restored. The Grants, predictably, backed William, but the Highlands tilted heavily Jacobite. Clans who had chafed under central authority saw the revolution as an opportunity to resist Edinburgh and restore a Stuart king who might grant them autonomy. Urquhart Castle, sitting at the strategic heart of the Highlands, became valuable again, not to the Grants, who barely had the resources to hold it, but to the Jacobites, who needed fortified bases for rebellion. In 1689, the Jacobite rising began. John Graham of Claverhouse, Bonnie Dundee, raised an army and won a stunning victory at Killiecrankie. For a moment, it seemed the Stuart cause might succeed, but Dundee died in the battle. Without his leadership, the rising collapsed within months. Urquhart was not directly attacked during the 1689 rising, but the Grants knew it was only a matter of time. Jacobite scouts had been seen near the loch. Intelligence reports suggested that several clans were planning coordinated assaults on Williamite positions across the Highlands. The Grant garrison at Urquhart numbered roughly 20 men in 1690, 20 men to hold walls designed for a garrison of 100. The situation was absurd, indefensible, and everyone knew it. In 1691, the garrison commander, a Grant officer, identified in records only as Captain Grant, wrote to the Privy Council in Edinburgh. His letter was brief and clear. Urquhart cannot be held with available men. The castle requires either substantial reinforcement or demolition. Leaving it intact invites Jacobite occupation and provides our enemies a fortress we cannot afford to besiege. I request authorization to destroy the fortifications. The letter is extraordinary. Commanders did not casually ask for permission to blow up castles. They were sworn to defend. The request reveals how dire Grant assessed the situation to be. He was openly admitting that holding Urquhart was impossible, that abandoning it intact was strategically unacceptable, and that the only rational option was to make it unusable for everyone. The Privy Council received the letter in late 1691. There was no debate, no committee formed to study the issue, no appeals from other clans or objections from the Crown. The authorization came back within a week. Approved. This is almost unprecedented in Scottish military history. Castles were symbols of power. Destroying them was an admission of weakness. Yet the Crown authorized the demolition of one of its most fought-over Highland fortresses without hesitation. The decision suggests two things. First, that Edinburgh understood the situation in the Highlands was deteriorating, and that resources needed to be concentrated at positions they could actually defend. Second, that Urquhart Castle's reputation, either as a money pit, a death trap, or both, had reached levels where even the government wanted it gone. In February 1692, engineers arrived at Urquhart Castle with barrels of gunpowder. The garrison had already packed and left, taking portable equipment and abandoning the rest. The engineers worked methodically. They placed charges at structural points, the gatehouse, sections of the curtain wall, the bases of corner towers. The goal was not to level the entire castle, but to make it indefensible, collapse the gates, breach the walls, render it impossible to garrison without massive reconstruction. On a cold morning, the fuses were lit. The explosions echoed across Loch Ness, heard miles away in villages along the shore. When the smoke cleared, the gatehouse was rubble. Large sections of the curtain wall had collapsed into the courtyard. The Grant Tower, built with exceptional care, remained standing. Its thick walls absorbed the shockwave, but every other major structure was compromised or destroyed. The garrison did not return. The Grants walked away. For the first time in over 400 years, no one fought to hold Urquhart Castle, because there was nothing left worth holding. Chapter 6. The Demolition Decision, 1692 AD. The decision to destroy Urquhart Castle in 1692 was made quickly, but the reasoning behind it had been building for decades. To understand why the Crown authorized such a drastic step, you have to understand what Scotland looked like at the end of the 17th century. The country was broke. The Darien scheme, an ambitious colonial venture meant to establish a Scottish trading empire in Central America, had collapsed by 1700 and drained enormous sums from the Scottish treasury. Before that, decades of war, occupation, and internal conflict had depleted royal finances. The Highlands were essentially ungovernable. Clans operated with near-total autonomy. The Crown could issue proclamations, appoint sheriffs, and confirm land grants, but enforcement was another matter. If a clan refused to comply, Edinburgh had limited options. Military expeditions into the Highlands were expensive and usually ineffective. Terrain favored defenders. Supply lines were fragile. Local knowledge gave clans advantages regular troops couldn't overcome. Castles like Urquhart were supposed to solve this problem. They were meant to project power, provide bases for royal authority, and deter rebellion. But that only worked if the castles could be held. By 1692, the math didn't work anymore. Holding Urquhart required a garrison of at least 50 men, ideally 100. Those men needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. Supplies had to be transported through hostile territory. Repairs cost thousands of pounds. And for what? To hold a single fortified point in a region where dozens of similar positions would be needed for actual control. The Grants had done their best. They had rebuilt after every raid. They had absorbed the costs beyond what the Crown provided, but they were reaching their limit. The 1691 letter from Captain Grant was an admission that the system had broken down. The Jacobite threat made the decision urgent. If the Grants abandoned Urquhart without destroying it, Jacobite forces would occupy it immediately. Then the Crown would face the prospect of besieging a castle that had been built to withstand exactly that. The 1689 Rising had shown that Jacobite forces could mobilize quickly and fight effectively. Giving them a ready-made fortress in the heart of the Highlands was strategically insane. So the Privy Council authorized demolition, not because they wanted to, but because it was the least bad option in a series of increasingly bad choices. The actual demolition was handled by military engineers, experienced in siege work. Blowing up a castle is not as simple as lighting barrels of gunpowder. You have to understand load-bearing structures, how walls are keyed together, where a collapse in one section will cascade to others. The engineers focused on the gatehouse first. This was the primary access point, and destroying it would make resupply nearly impossible for anyone trying to reoccupy the castle. Charges were placed at the base of the gatehouse towers and at the hinges of the main gate. When they detonated, the entire structure came down, filling the entrance passage with rubble. Next, they targeted sections of the curtain wall. The goal was to create breaches large enough that the walls could no longer serve as defensive barriers. Multiple charges were set along the north and west walls, chosen because collapsing them inward would bury interior structures under stone. The Grant Tower was not directly targeted. Whether this was deliberate, a decision to leave one structure standing as a landmark, or simply practical, the tower's walls were thick enough that demolishing it would have required far more explosives than other sections, is unclear. But the tower survived, and its survival meant that Urquhart Castle, even in ruins, would remain visible and recognizable for centuries. The explosions were heard across the Great Glen. Locals described the sound as thunder, even though the sky was clear. Some later accounts claim that the loch itself rippled with the shock waves, though this is likely exaggeration. When the engineers left, Urquhart Castle was a ruin. But unlike the ruins created by Robert the Bruce 400 years earlier, this destruction was final. There would be no royal funds for rebuilding. No clan would take responsibility for restoration. The crown had made its position clear. Urquhart was no longer worth defending. For the Grants, the loss was complicated. On one hand, they were relieved. The castle had been a financial and psychological burden. Men feared serving there. Costs had spiraled out of control. Abandoning it made practical sense. On the other hand, Urquhart had been theirs for 183 years. It had been a symbol of their authority, their loyalty to the crown, their status among Highland clans. Walking away felt like failure, even if the failure was systemic rather than personal. Local reactions were mixed. Some saw the demolition as tragic, a piece of history destroyed. Others saw it as inevitable. The castle had brought nothing but violence to the region. A few saw it as justice. Urquhart had been a seat of power that enforced rules many Highlanders resented. Its destruction was one less tool the crown could use to control them. But the strangest reactions came from people who had never set foot in the castle. Travelers passing through the Great Glen in the late 1690s and early 1700s wrote about the ruins. Many described them as melancholy or haunting, but several accounts mention something else, a sense of relief. One English traveler, writing in 1702, described approaching the ruins at dusk and feeling as if a great weight had been lifted, though I cannot say what weight or why. This might simply be the natural human response to seeing a place of violence reduced to silence, or it might be something else. The killing had stopped. After 400 years of raids, sieges, massacres, and endless cycles of capture and recapture, Urquhart Castle was finally, permanently at peace, because there was nothing left to fight over. Chapter 7. What remains 1692, present. For the next 200 years, Urquhart Castle slowly disappeared, not physically. The ruins were too substantial to vanish entirely, but they ceased to be a living part of Scottish life. No one lived there. No garrison watched from the walls. No fires burned in the hearths. The stones, however, did not go to waste. Local people, practical and poor, began pulling dressed stone from the ruins to use in their own buildings. A cottage here, a barn there, field walls marking property boundaries. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, chunks of Urquhart were scattered across the surrounding countryside, repurposed into structures that served living people rather than dead ambitions. This was not vandalism in the modern sense. It was normal. Medieval and early modern people saw ruins as quarries, free stone for those willing to haul it away. Urquhart's remoteness meant it wasn't stripped as quickly as more accessible ruins, but the process was steady. By 1800, large sections of the curtain wall had been reduced to foundation courses. Interior buildings were rubble. Only the Grant Tower stood relatively intact, too solid to dismantle easily, and perhaps left standing as a navigational landmark for travelers on the loch. The 19th century brought new visitors, not armies, not clans, tourists. The Romantic movement in art and literature had reframed ruins as picturesque, as symbols of noble decay and lost grandeur. Writers like Sir Walter Scott popularized Highland culture, and tourists began traveling to Scotland to see landscapes and castles they had read about in novels and poetry. Urquhart, sitting on the shore of Loch Ness, with its dramatic backdrop of mountains and water, was perfect for this new kind of attention. Artists came to sketch, travelers came to stand among the stones and imagine medieval battles. The violence was distant enough to be romantic rather than traumatic. In 1913, Urquhart Castle was placed under the protection of the state. The Office of Works, later Historic Environment Scotland, took responsibility for stabilizing the ruins and preventing further collapse or removal of stone. This marked a fundamental shift. The castle stopped being something people could take from and became something people were expected to preserve. Restoration work began in the 1920s. The Grant Tower was reinforced. Walkways were installed. Interpretive signage went up explaining the castle's history in sanitized, visitor-friendly terms. World War II briefly interrupted tourism, but by the 1950s, visitors were returning in growing numbers. Urquhart became one of Scotland's most photographed sites, its ruins appearing in travel brochures and postcards. The Loch Ness monster legend, which had exploded in popularity in the 1930s, brought even more tourists. People came hoping to see the monster. While they waited, they visited the castle. By the 1990s, Urquhart was receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. A modern visitor center was built in the early 2000s, complete with parking, a gift shop, and a short film about the castle's history. Today, approximately 400,000 people visit Urquhart Castle each year. They walk through the ruins, climb the Grant Tower, and take photos against Loch Ness. Most spend 30 minutes to an hour on site. They listen to audio guides that narrate battles from 700 years ago. They read plaques that mention clans and sieges in tones that make violence sound distant and abstract. What the modern visitor experience rarely conveys is the weight of those 400 years. The audio guides mention that the castle changed hands many times but rarely specify how many or what that actually meant. The signage talks about clan conflicts without describing what clan warfare looked like: burning, killing, the erasure of entire families. The visitor center film shows dramatic reenactments of medieval combat, but does not linger on the aftermath. Bodies left to rot, survivors enslaved or displaced. The grinding, repetitive horror of a place that could not hold peace. This is not unique to Urquhart. Most historic sites sanitize their past to make it palatable for tourists. But Urquhart sanitization is particularly thorough because its actual history is particularly dark. The question modern historians and tour guides face is how much of that darkness to convey. Tell the full story. The massacres, the mysterious deaths, the decision to blow up your own castle because keeping it was worse than losing it. And you risk alienating visitors who came for a pleasant day out. Sanitize it too much, and Urquhart becomes just another picturesque ruin, indistinguishable from dozens of others across Scotland. Some guides have tried to strike a balance. In recent years, tours have begun acknowledging the violence more directly. They mention the 1545 massacre. They talk about Garrison mortality rates. They explain why the castle was demolished rather than simply abandoned. But even these more honest tours struggle with one part of the story: the persistent local belief that Urquhart was haunted. Modern Historic Environment Scotland materials avoid supernatural language entirely. The castle is described in terms of military strategy, architectural features, and historical significance. Ghosts are not mentioned, yet visitors continue to report strange experiences, feeling suddenly cold in the lower chambers. Even on warm days, hearing sounds, scraping, footsteps, voices, when no one else is around. An overwhelming sense of being watched, particularly in the cellars and near the ruins of the original gatehouse. Some of this can be explained. Old stone holds cold. Wind creates echoes. Tourists are suggestible, primed by ghost stories and the eerie atmosphere of ruins. The human brain excels at finding patterns and meaning in random stimuli. but the consistency of the reports is notable. Guides who work at Urquhart year-round describe certain areas of the castle that tourists consistently avoid, not because the ruins are more damaged or harder to access, but because visitors feel uncomfortable. They walk past quickly or skip those sections entirely. The Grant Tower, oddly, is less frequently photographed than the more ruined sections of the castle. It offers the best views. It's the most intact structure, yet visitors spend less time there on average than they do exploring the collapsed gatehouse or walking the fragmentary curtain walls. When asked, some say the tower doesn't feel right. Others describe it as oppressive or sad. These are subjective impressions, meaningless as evidence of anything supernatural, but they echo something the historical record shows. People have always been uneasy at Urquhart, long before modern tourism, long before ghost stories became marketable. Whether that unease stems from the lingering psychological weight of violence, from collective memory passed down through generations, or from something less easily explained, is not a question the guidebooks are designed to answer. What remains certain is this: Urquhart Castle stands today, not because anyone fought to preserve it, but because destruction was never quite complete. The Grant Tower endures because it was built too well to fall. The walls endure because they were too massive to fully dismantle. But what endures more than stone is the question the castle forces on anyone who learns its full history. Why did it take total destruction to finally bring peace to a fortress that everyone wanted, but no one could hold? Chapter 8. The Weight of Stone Conclusion. Walk through Urquhart Castle today, and the overwhelming impression is silence. The wind off Loch Ness is the loudest sound. Seabirds cry. Tourists murmur to each other in a dozen languages, but the castle itself is quiet in a way that feels deliberate, as if the stones have learned not to speak. This is a different silence than you feel at other ruins. Edinburgh Castle is silent when visitors leave, but it's a proud silence. The silence of something that still stands and still matters. Urquhart's silence is heavier. It's the silence of something that gave up. Historians will tell you that castles don't have agency. They don't give up. They are structures built by people, used by people, and destroyed by people. Urquhart's story is the story of those people. The builders, the defenders, the attackers, the victims. The castle is just where it happened. But there is something about this particular place that exceeds the sum of its historical events. 500 years of violence leaves a residue that statistics and battle accounts cannot fully capture. Urquhart was fought over more intensely, for longer than almost any other fortress in Scotland. It was captured and recaptured 40 times. It was deliberately destroyed at least 3 separate times, by Robert the Bruce, by raiding clans, and finally by its own garrison. That is not normal. That is not simply strategic importance. Dozens of other castles in Scotland were just as strategic. Stirling Castle controlled central Scotland. Edinburgh Castle was the seat of royal power. Dunatar protected key ports. All of them saw violence. None of them saw violence at Urquhart's scale and frequency. So what made Urquhart different? Geography is the obvious answer. The Great Glen was a natural corridor that any army moving through the Highlands had to use. Urquhart sat at the midpoint, unavoidable. Controlling it meant controlling movement through the region. But geography alone doesn't explain the pattern. If controlling Urquhart was so valuable, why did so many families voluntarily abandon it? Why did garrison soldiers desert at unusually high rates? Why did the Grants, after holding it longer than anyone, request permission to blow it up, rather than simply hand it to a rival clan? The explanations break into 2 camps: practical and folkloric. The practical explanation goes like this. Urquhart was a nightmare to supply and defend. It sat in remote, hostile territory. Every delivery of food, weapons, or pay required a convoy through land controlled by rival clans, who had every reason to ambush it. The castle was surrounded by enemies, and too far from reliable allies. Anyone holding it was isolated, vulnerable, and constantly under threat. The psychological strain of defending an indefensible position led to high desertion rates. The physical strain, poor sanitation, cold, damp conditions, limited medical care, led to high mortality. This explanation is convincing. It accounts for most of the documented problems without requiring supernatural intervention. It fits with what we know about medieval and early modern military life, but it struggles with certain details. Why did the Grant Tower face inland when every military convention of the era dictated that watchtowers face water? Why were Cromwell's soldiers, professional, experienced troops who had fought across 3 kingdoms, dying at rates double or triple what they experienced elsewhere? Why did multiple written accounts from different centuries describe the same sense of unease, the same reports of cold and strange sounds, the same instinct to leave? The folkloric explanation offers different answers. It says that Urquhart was built on ground that should have been left alone, that Christian monks had deliberately built over Pictish sacred sites, inviting retribution from older, darker things, that 5 centuries of bloodshed soaked into the stone, creating a place that simply consumed people, whether through violence, disease, or something harder to name. This explanation is not convincing to modern historians. It relies on supernatural causation, which is unfalsifiable and therefore useless as historical analysis. It reflects local storytelling traditions rather than documentary evidence. But it fits the emotional reality of Urquhart in a way that pure practicality does not, because the people who lived through Urquhart's history felt that something was wrong with the place, not just strategically difficult, wrong. They felt it strongly enough that it appears in letters, memoirs, and garrison reports across centuries. Feeling is not evidence, but when the same feeling persists for 500 years, it becomes something worth acknowledging. The truth, almost certainly, is that both explanations contain pieces of the whole. Urquhart Castle was a strategic nightmare that killed people through cold, practical violence, and it was also a place that accumulated so much trauma that even the stones seemed cursed. Those two things are not contradictory. They reinforce each other. The practical reality, constant warfare, terrible conditions, unsustainable costs, created the psychological reality. People died at Urquhart faster than they died elsewhere. That built a reputation. The reputation made soldiers reluctant to serve there. The reluctance made garrisons understaffed and morale low. Low morale led to more deaths. More deaths fed the reputation. It's a cycle that needs no ghosts to explain. But it also creates exactly the conditions where belief in ghosts becomes rational. When people die inexplicably, when a place feels hostile, when every reasonable effort to fix the situation fails, the conclusion that something beyond human control is at work is not superstition. It's a logical response to an illogical pattern. The modern visitor to Urquhart Castle will not be told any of this. The gift shop sells mugs with cheerful tartan patterns. The visitor center film presents the castle as a symbol of Scottish resilience and heritage. The guided tours focus on architecture and clan history, presenting violence as something that happened to other people in another time. This is normal. Tourism requires sanitization. No one wants to take photos at a place described as cursed and traumatic. Families don't want their children learning that medieval warfare meant burning people alive, enslaving survivors, and leaving bodies to rot because burying them was too expensive in time and labor. But the sanitization comes at a cost. It turns Urquhart into just another ruin, remarkable for its views and its proximity to the Loch Ness monster legend, but unremarkable in terms of what it represents. What Urquhart actually represents is the limit of power, the point where even wealth, even royal authority, even strategic necessity cannot force success. The castle was rebuilt repeatedly, funded repeatedly, garrisoned repeatedly. None of it mattered. The place could not be held, not by the English, not by the Scots, not by any clan, no matter how powerful or determined. So they destroyed it. Not because destruction was the goal, but because it was the only way to stop the cycle. That decision, made in 1692, by people who had watched Urquhart consume lives and resources for generations, is the most honest thing anyone ever did with the castle. It was an admission that some problems cannot be solved, that some ground cannot be held, that sometimes the smart choice is to walk away, even if it means blowing up what you built to ensure no one else can use it against you. Urquhart Castle stands today as a monument to that admission. It is beautiful in the way ruins are always beautiful. Stones softened by centuries of weather, empty windows framing views of water and mountains, the promise of history without the burden of living through it. But it is also a reminder that violence compounds, that trauma layers, that some places hold on to the worst things that happen there, whether in collective memory or in something less easily named. The tourists come. They take their photos. They walk through rooms where people died screaming. They stand on walls where soldiers froze through winter watches, knowing that the next raid or the next illness or simply the next cold night might be the one that killed them. And most of them feel nothing, because the stones are quiet now. The silence is complete. But for those who know the history, who read the letters and the death tolls in the dry administrative language describing unknown causes and desertion and ruin, the silence is less comforting. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of exhaustion, the silence of something that fought for so long it finally broke. Urquhart Castle was never defeated. It was abandoned. There is a difference. Defeat means the enemy won. Abandonment means both sides gave up. In 1692, Scotland gave up on Urquhart. The Crown authorized its destruction. The Grants walked away. The stones were left to fall, and for the first time in 400 years, no one died there. Perhaps that is the only victory that place ever achieved. Not by standing strong, not by holding against impossible odds, but by ceasing to exist as anything worth fighting for. The castle that witnessed 1,000 deaths finally brought peace to the Great Glen by becoming a memory. The question that remains, the question the guidebooks will never ask, is what that says about the cost of power and the weight of history and the things we build on ground that was never meant to hold them. Urquhart Castle cannot answer. It is stone and ruin and the slow, patient work of weather and time. But the silence speaks anyway. If you know how to listen,